In court, the millionaire froze, but his maid recited the law and silenced the judge. Welcome to another incredible true story that will leave you speechless. Before we begin, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss stories like this one. And tell us in the comments below, where in the world are you listening to this amazing story from? We love hearing from our global family. Today's story takes place in the heart of Manhattan, New York, where wealth and power collide with justice in the most unexpected way. What happens when a millionaire's world crumbles in a courtroom, and the person who saves him is someone society would never expect? Get ready for a tale that will restore your faith in the power of knowledge, courage, and the human spirit. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Harrison mansion on the Upper East Side. At exactly 6:30 a.m., Elena Martinez quietly entered through the service entrance, her worn sneakers making no sound on the polished surfaces. She had been the head housekeeper for the Harrison family for 12 years, and in all that time, she had never seen her employer, Richard Harrison, look as troubled as he did today. Richard Harrison was a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life. At 52, he had built a real estate empire worth over $200 million. His name graced the sides of skyscrapers throughout Manhattan, and his influence reached into the highest circles of New York society. Yet this morning, as Elena arranged fresh orchids in the main foyer, she noticed him pacing back and forth in his study, his usually perfect silver hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he had slept in it. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Elena said softly as she knocked on the study door. "Would you like your usual breakfast?" Richard looked up from the stack of legal documents scattered across his mahogany desk. His face was pale, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Elena, I don't think I can eat anything right now." This was unprecedented. In 12 years, Richard Harrison had never missed his morning routine of fresh coffee, whole grain toast, and perfectly prepared eggs Benedict. Elena stepped closer, her maternal instincts overriding the professional distance she usually maintained. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying, you look like you haven't slept. Is everything all right?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "All right? No, Elena. Everything is decidedly not all right. I have to appear in court today, and I might lose everything I've worked for my entire life." Eleanor had heard whispers among the other staff about legal troubles. The family's longtime chauffeur, Miguel, had mentioned seeing process servers at the front gate multiple times over the past month, but she had never imagined the situation was this serious. "Would you like to talk about it, sir? Sometimes speaking about our troubles can help us see them more clearly." Richard studied Elena's face. She was a petite woman in her 40s, with kind brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had been more than just an employee. She had been a constant, reliable presence in his life through his divorce, his father's death, and the countless pressures of running his business empire. "It's a lawsuit, Elena. A massive one. 3 years ago, I purchased a block of apartments in Brooklyn. Low-income housing. I evicted the tenants to renovate and sell the units as luxury condos. It was all legal, or so I thought." He ran his hands through his hair. "But the tenants' advocacy group is claiming I violated rent stabilization laws. They're saying I owe millions in penalties and damages." Elena listened carefully, her expression growing more serious. "And your lawyers?" "That's just it. My main attorney, James Crawford, had a heart attack yesterday. He's in intensive care. The junior associates are scrambling, but they're not prepared for a case this complex. I'm walking into that courtroom practically defenseless." The weight of the situation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. Eleanor had never seen him show such vulnerability. "Sir, may I ask what specific laws they're claiming you violated?" Richard looked surprised by the question. "Something about the Rent Stabilization Code and the Housing Maintenance Code." "Eleanor, why do you ask?" "Just curious, sir. I've always been interested in law." She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. "My daughter is in her 2nd year of law school at Columbia. She often discusses her cases with me." What Richard didn't know was that Elena's interest in law went far deeper than casual curiosity. After arriving from El Salvador 20 years ago, she had worked multiple jobs to support her family while studying English at night. For the past 8 years, she had been taking paralegal courses at the local community college, one class at a time, whenever her schedule allowed. She had become fascinated by housing law in particular, especially after helping several families in her neighborhood navigate disputes with landlords. "I should get going soon," Richard said, glancing at his Rolex. "The hearing is at 10 a.m. Elena nodded, but something in her expression suggested she was deep in thought. "Mr. Harrison, would you mind if I accompanied you today? I know it's unusual, but I'd like to be there to support you." Richard was touched by the offer. "That's very kind of you, Elena, but you don't need to waste your day sitting in a courtroom." "It wouldn't be a waste, sir. You've always been fair to me and my family. It's the least I can do." An hour later, Elena watched from the back seat as their car navigated through the heavy Manhattan traffic toward the courthouse. Richard sat rigidly in the passenger seat, his knuckles white as he gripped his briefcase. She had never seen him look so defeated, so small. The man who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals with a handshake was terrified of what awaited him in that courtroom. As they pulled up to the imposing stone facade of the New York County Courthouse, Elena made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She quietly opened her small purse and pulled out a worn notebook, the same one she had been using to take notes during her paralegal classes. Today, she would need every piece of knowledge she had accumulated over the past 8 years. Chapter 2. The Storm Before the Calm. The courtroom was packed with reporters, tenant advocates, and curious onlookers. Richard Harrison sat at the defendant's table, flanked by 2 nervous-looking junior associates who seemed more concerned with their phones than the massive case before them. Eleanor had taken a seat in the public gallery, her notebook hidden discreetly in her lap. Judge Patricia Monroe entered the courtroom with the commanding presence of someone who had presided over thousands of cases. At 65D, she was known for her no-nonsense approach and her intolerance for unprepared attorneys. Her reputation preceded her. She had once held a lawyer in contempt for showing up to court without properly reviewing the case file. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Monroe," called the bailiff as everyone stood. Elena studied the judge's face. She had researched Judge Monroe's background and knew she had a particular concern for housing rights, having grown up in public housing herself before working her way through law school. "Please be seated," Judge Monroe said, her voice cutting through the courtroom's murmur. "We are here today for the matter of Thompson versus Harrison Properties, case number HC 2024-7891. This is a hearing regarding alleged violations of rent stabilization laws and improper eviction procedures." The lead attorney for the plaintiffs, Maria Santos, stood up. She was a formidable woman in her 50s who had built her career defending tenants' rights. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs represent 43 families who were illegally evicted from their rent-stabilized apartments at 147 Maple Street in Brooklyn. Mr. Harrison's company violated multiple sections of the Rent Stabilization Code, the Housing Maintenance Code, and the Real Property Actions and Proceedings Law." Judge Monroe nodded and turned to the defense table. "And how does the defendant respond?" One of the junior associates, David Chen, stood up uncertainly. He was barely 30 years old and had only been practicing law for 3 years. "Your Honor, we maintain that all evictions were conducted in accordance with applicable laws and regulations." "I see. And where is Mr. Crawford today? I was expecting him to represent the defendant." David's face reddened. "Mr. Crawford he's indisposed, Your Honor. He had a medical emergency." Judge Monroe's expression grew stern. "Mr. Chen, are you prepared to argue this case on the merits?" "Yes, Your Honor, we're prepared." But it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that they were not prepared at all. Elena watched as David shuffled through his papers, clearly lost. She glanced at Richard, who had gone completely pale. Maria Santos began her opening argument with devastating precision. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mr. Harrison's company systematically violated the rights of rent-stabilized tenants. First, they failed to provide proper notice as required under Section 226C of the Real Property Law. Second, they illegally increased rents beyond the guidelines established by the Rent Guidelines Board. Third, they failed to maintain essential services as required under the Housing Maintenance Code, specifically Sections 27-2004 through 27-2006. Elena found herself taking notes, her years of studying housing law allowing her to follow every detail of the argument. She noticed several key points that the defense should have been addressing, but David Chen remained silent, apparently overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. "Furthermore," Maria continued, "the defendant violated the Rent Stabilization Code by failing to register the apartments with the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal as required under Section 2520(11). This alone subjects the defendant to penalties of up to $1,000 per unit per month for each month of non-compliance." Elena did a quick calculation in her head. 43 units, potentially 3 years of violations. The penalties alone could exceed $4 million. Judge Monroe turned to the defense table. "Mr. Chen, I'd like to hear your response to these allegations." David Chen stood up slowly, his hands visibly shaking. "Your Honor, We contend that our client acted in good faith and followed all applicable procedures. That's not a legal argument, Mr. Chen. Can you address the specific statutory violations cited by the plaintiff? David looked down at his papers, then back up at the judge. Your Honor, we would need more time to review the specific code sections mentioned. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Elena could see Richard's hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He was watching his empire crumble before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do about it. Judge Monroe's voice carried a note of warning. Mr. Chen, this case has been on the calendar for 6 months. Are you telling me that you haven't reviewed the relevant statutes? No, Your Honor. I mean, we have reviewed them. But what, Mr. Chen? David fell silent, clearly out of his depth. Elena could see sweat beading on his forehead as he struggled to find words. Maria Santos stood again. Your Honor, if I may continue with the evidence presentation, please proceed. Ms. Santos. As Maria began detailing the specific violations, Eleanor noticed that she had made several small but potentially significant errors in her citations. She had confused sections of the Housing Maintenance Code and had incorrectly stated the penalties under the Rent Stabilization Code. These were the kinds of mistakes that a skilled defense attorney would immediately challenge, but David Chen was completely missing them. Elena watched Richard slump further in his chair with each passing minute. The man who had built a real estate empire was being destroyed by legal technicalities he didn't understand, defended by lawyers who were equally lost. As the morning wore on, it became clear that this was going to be a complete disaster for the defense. Elena felt a knot forming in her stomach as she watched Richard's life's work hang in the balance. She had seen him at his best and worst over the years. She knew he wasn't a cruel man, just someone who had made mistakes and was now paying dearly for them. At 11:30 a.m., Judge Monroe called for a brief recess. "We'll reconvene in 15 minutes, she announced, her tone suggesting she was growing impatient with the defense's lack of preparation. As the courtroom emptied, Elena made her way to where Richard sat, still frozen at the defense table. His face was ashen, and he looked like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, "are you all right?" Richard looked up at her with the expression of a man who had just watched his world collapse. "Elena, I'm finished. They're going to take everything. My company, my properties, everything I've worked for my entire life." Elena glanced around the courtroom, then leaned closer. "Tyser, may I make a suggestion?" Chapter 3, The Unlikely Advocate. Richard looked at Elena with desperate eyes. "What kind of suggestion?" Elena glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then spoke in a low voice. "Sir, I've been following the case, and I think there might be some arguments that haven't been raised yet." "What do you mean?" "Well, for instance, Ms. Santos cited Section 2520.11 of the Rent Stabilization Code regarding registration requirements, but she failed to mention that there's an exception under Section 2520 for buildings that underwent substantial rehabilitation. Did your company perform any major renovations before the evictions?" Richard's eyes widened. "Yes, we spent over $2 million on infrastructure improvements, new plumbing, electrical systems, heating." "But how do you know about these legal provisions?" Eleanor hesitated. "I've been studying paralegal courses for 8 years, sir. Housing law it's something I'm passionate about." Before Richard could respond, David Chen approached them, looking even more panicked than before. "Mr. Harrison, I have to be honest with you. I don't think we can win this case. Ms. Santos is right about most of her points, and I'm not equipped to handle something this complex." "David, what if I told you there might be some defenses we haven't explored?" Richard said. "Like what?" Richard turned to Elena. "Elena, could you explain to David what you just told me?" Elena felt her heart racing. She had never spoken to a lawyer in a professional capacity before, but she knew this might be Richard's only chance. "Mr. Chen, I noticed several things during Miss Santos' presentation that might be worth addressing." David looked confused. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Harrison's housekeeper," Elena said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "But I've also been studying housing law for several years." David's expression was skeptical, but Richard interrupted. "David, at this point, I'm willing to listen to anyone who might have ideas. What did you notice, Elena?" Elena pulled out her notebook. "First, regarding the registration requirements under Section 2520.11, there's an exception for buildings that underwent substantial rehabilitation. If you spent over $2 million on infrastructure improvements, that might qualify." David flipped through his papers. I don't see anything about that exception in our research. It's in subdivision F of Section 2520.11, Elena said gently. "Also, Ms. Santos mentioned violations of the Housing Maintenance Code, specifically Sections 27-2004 through 27 to 2006, but she didn't address the fact that if you were providing temporary housing to displaced tenants during renovations, that might mitigate some of the damages. David stared at her. How do you know all this? I've been taking paralegal courses at Manhattan Community College for 8 years, Elena explained. I've studied housing law extensively because I've helped families in my neighborhood with housing disputes. Richard felt a spark of hope for the first time all day. Elena, do you think you could help us prepare for the afternoon session? Sir, I'm not a lawyer. I can't represent you in court. No, but you could help David understand the legal arguments. Eleanor looked at David, who appeared to be struggling with the idea of taking legal advice from a housekeeper. Mr. Chen, I don't want to overstep, but I think there are several defenses that haven't been explored. David was quiet for a moment, then sighed. At this point, I'm willing to listen to any suggestions. We're getting destroyed in there. For the next 10 minutes, Eleanor walked David through her notes. She explained the substantial rehabilitation exception, the temporary housing provisions, and several other potential defenses. Most importantly, she pointed out the errors in Ms. Santos and citations. She said the penalty under Section 2520.11 is $1,000 per unit per month, Eleanor explained. But that's only for willful violations. For non-willful violations, the penalty is much lower, and there's also a cure period that might apply. David's eyes widened as he began to understand. So even if we lose on the main issues, we might be able to significantly reduce the damages. Exactly. And there's something else, Elena said. Mrs. Santos cited the real property actions and proceedings law regarding notice requirements, but she referenced the wrong section. She cited Section 226CC, but for rent-stabilized apartments, it should be Section 226B. The notice requirements are different. David was frantically taking notes now. This is incredible. How did you catch all these mistakes? I've been studying these codes for years, Eleanor said simply. First, when you're helping families who might lose their homes, you learn to pay attention to details. Richard watched this exchange with growing amazement. Elena, the woman who had quietly cleaned his house for 12 years, was demonstrating a knowledge of housing law that surpassed his expensive attorneys. The bailiff called for everyone to return to the courtroom. As they took their seats, Eleanor noticed that David looked more confident than before. She had given him a roadmap, but now he would have to execute it. Judge Monroe resumed the hearing. Miss Santos, please continue with your presentation. As Mrs. Santos continued her argument, Elena watched David carefully. When Mrs. Santos mentioned the registration requirements, David stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is misstating the law. Judge Monroe looked surprised. What is your basis for the objection, Mr. Chen? Your Honor. Counsel cited Section 2520.11 regarding registration requirements, but failed to mention the exception under subdivision F for buildings that underwent substantial rehabilitation. Ms. Santos looked momentarily confused. Your Honor, I don't believe that exception applies in this case. Miss Santos, are you familiar with the substantial rehabilitation exception? Your Honor, I would need to review the specific language of that provision. Elena felt a surge of satisfaction. David was using her research effectively, and it was already changing the dynamics of the case. Judge Monroe made a note. Mr. Chen, do you have evidence that your client's building underwent substantial rehabilitation? Yes, Your Honor. We have documentation of over $2 million in infrastructure improvements, including complete renovation of plumbing, electrical, and heating systems. Very well, please provide that documentation to the court and to opposing counsel. For the first time since the hearing began, Elena saw Richard sit up straighter. David was gaining confidence, and the tide was slowly beginning to turn. Chapter 4. The Moment of Truth. The afternoon session had been going better for the defense, but Elena could see that David was still struggling with the more complex legal arguments. Mrs. Santos had regrouped during the lunch break and was now pressing harder on the penalties and damages. Your Honor, Mrs. Santos said, even if the court finds that some of the defendant's actions were justified, the evidence clearly shows willful violations of the Rent Stabilization Code. The penalties should reflect the serious nature of these violations. Judge Monroe turned to the defense table. Mr. Chen, how do you respond to the allegation of willful violations? David stood up, but Elena could see his confidence wavering. Your Honor, we contend that our client acted in good faith and... Mr. Chen, that's not a legal standard. Under the Rent Stabilization Code, the question is whether the violations were willful or non-willful. Can you address that specific issue? David looked down at his notes, then back up at the judge. Elena could see him struggling. He had been doing better with her coaching, but this was a complex area of law that required precise arguments. Your Honor, we would argue that the violations were not willful because David faltered, clearly losing his train of thought. Eleanor watched as Richard's face went pale again. They had made some progress, but David was still out of his depth on the most critical issues. Judge Monroe's patience was wearing thin. Mr. Chen, I need a coherent legal argument, not general statements about good faith. Elena felt her heart racing. She could see the specific argument that needed to be made, but David was missing it. The case was slipping away again, and Richard was about to lose everything. In that moment, Elena made a decision that would change her life forever. She stood up from her seat in the public gallery. Your Honor, may I approach the bench? The entire courtroom turned to look at her. Judge Monroe appeared stunned. Ma'am, who are you? I'm Elena Martinez, Your Honor. I work for Mr. Harrison, and I've been studying housing law for 8 years. I believe there's a critical legal argument that hasn't been presented. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Ms. Santos jumped to her feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This person is not an attorney and has no standing to address the court. Judge Monroe held up her hand for silence. Ms. Martinez, you are correct that this is highly irregular. However, given the inadequate representation the defendant has received today, I'm going to allow you to speak. But I want to be clear. You are not representing the defendant, and anything you say is merely advisory. Elena felt every eye in the courtroom on her as she walked to the front. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Your Honor, regarding the question of willful versus non-willful violations, the relevant standard is found in Section 2524(4) of the Rent Stabilization Code. Her violation is only considered willful if the defendant had actual knowledge of the legal requirements and chose to ignore them. Judge Monroe leaned forward, clearly interested. Continue. The evidence shows that Mr. Harrison relied on legal counsel throughout the renovation process. He hired attorneys and consultants specifically to ensure compliance with housing laws. While mistakes were made, this demonstrates good faith effort to comply, not willful disregard of the law. Eleanor pulled out her notebook. Furthermore, Your Honor, several of the alleged violations cited by the plaintiff are based on incorrect legal citations. For example, Ms. Santos referenced Section 226C of the Real Property Actions and Proceedings Law for notice requirements, but the correct section for rent-stabilized apartments is Section 226B. Ms. Santos looked shocked. Your Honor, I object to this entire proceeding. This person is not qualified to make legal arguments. Judge Monroe studied Elena carefully. Ms. Martinez, you mentioned that you've been studying housing law for 8 years. In what capacity? I've been taking paralegal courses at Manhattan Community College, Your Honor. I've completed coursework in housing law, landlord-tenant relations, and administrative law. I've also helped families in my neighborhood navigate housing disputes. And you caught the error in Mrs. Santos' citation. Yes, Your Honor. Section 226C applies to general landlord-tenant relationships, but Section 226B has specific requirements for rent-stabilized apartments. The notice period is different, and the content requirements are more stringent. Judge Monroe turned to Miss Santos. Miss Santos, how do you respond to this? Miss Santos was clearly flustered. Your Honor, I would need to review the specific language of Section 226B. Ms. Santos, this is basic housing law. Are you telling me you're not familiar with the notice requirements for rent-stabilized apartments? Elena continued, her confidence growing. Your Honor, there's also the issue of penalties. Ms. Santos has calculated damages based on the assumption that all violations were willful. But if the court finds that some or all violations were non-willful, the penalties would be significantly reduced. What would be the difference in penalties? For willful violations, the penalty is up to $1,000 per unit per month. For non-willful violations, it's typically $100 per unit per month, and there's often a cure period that allows the defendant to correct violations before penalties accrue. Judge Monroe was taking notes. And you believe the evidence supports a finding of non-willful violations? Yes, Your Honor. The evidence shows that Mr. Harrison spent over $2 million on building improvements, hired legal counsel, and attempted to follow proper procedures. When mistakes were made, they appear to have been errors in judgment rather than deliberate violations of the law. Elena took a deep breath and continued. Finally, Your Honor, I believe there's been an error in calculating the number of affected units. Mrs. Santos claimed 43 units, but the building records show that only 37 units were actually subject to rent stabilization at the time of the evictions. Mrs. Santos stood up quickly. Your Honor, I object to this entire line of argument. This person has no legal standing to make these these claims. Judge Monroe looked at Elena with a mixture of surprise and respect. Ms. Martinez, these are very detailed and specific legal arguments. Are you certain about your research? Yes, Your Honor. I've spent years studying these codes, and I've double-checked all my citations. The judge turned to David Chen. Mr. Chen, do you adopt these arguments on behalf of your client? David stood up, looking amazed. Yes, Your Honor. We fully adopt these arguments. Judge Monroe was quiet for a long moment, studying her notes. Finally, she spoke. This is one of the most unusual situations I've encountered in 30 years on the bench. Miss Martinez, your knowledge of housing law is impressive, and your arguments are well-reasoned and supported by the relevant statutes. Elena felt her heart pounding as she waited for the judge's decision. Based on the arguments presented, I find that while the defendant did violate certain provisions of the Rent Stabilization Code, the evidence does not support a finding of willful violations. The defendant's good faith efforts to comply with the law, including hiring legal counsel and making substantial investments in building improvements, demonstrate that any violations were the result of misunderstanding rather than deliberate disregard for the law. The courtroom was silent as Judge Monroe continued. Furthermore, the court finds that the plaintiff has made several errors in her legal citations and damage calculations. The penalties will be calculated based on non-willful violations, and the number of affected units is 37, not 43, as claimed. Eleanor felt tears of relief welling up in her eyes. Richard was looking at her with an expression of pure gratitude and amazement. The court orders the defendant to pay penalties of $100 per unit per month for the period of non-compliance, totaling $133,200, rather than the $4.3 million originally sought by the plaintiff. The gavel came down, and Elena knew she had just changed the course of Richard's life, and her own. Chapter 5. A New Beginning. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in the same study where she had first seen Richard's desperation, but everything had changed. The legal documents were gone from the desk, replaced by brochures for law schools and paralegal certification programs. Richard was seated behind his desk, but this time he was smiling. "Eleanor, I still can't believe what you did in that courtroom," Richard said, shaking his head in amazement. "You saved my company, my life's work. How can I ever thank you?" Elena smoothed her uniform and smiled. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Harrison. I just did what I thought was right. But it was so much more than that," Richard insisted. "You demonstrated knowledge that surpassed lawyers who went to Harvard and Yale. You saw things that trained attorneys missed. You have a gift, Elena." Over the past 3 weeks, Richard had learned more about Elena's background. He discovered that she had been sending money to El Salvador to support her elderly parents, while also paying for her daughter's law school education. He learned that she had been studying at night for 8 years, one class at a time, because she couldn't afford to study full-time. Most importantly, he learned that she had been helping families in her neighborhood with housing disputes for years, never charging a fee. "Elena, I have a proposition for you," Richard said, standing up from his desk. "I want to offer you a position as the Director of Tenant Relations for Harrison Properties." Elena's eyes widened. I don't understand. What happened in that courtroom showed me that I need someone who truly understands housing law and genuinely cares about people. You've been studying this field for years, and you've proven that you can handle complex legal issues. But Mr. Harrison, I'm not a lawyer. No, but you're something even more valuable. You're someone who combines legal knowledge with genuine compassion. I want you to help me transform how my company operates. Instead of just focusing on profits, I want to make sure we're treating tenants fairly and following all applicable laws. Eleanor felt overwhelmed. "Sir, this is very generous, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for such a position." Richard walked around the desk and stood in front of her. "Elena, you were more qualified than my expensive attorneys. You saved my company from a $4 million judgment. You caught legal errors that trained lawyers missed. If that doesn't qualify you, I don't know what does. What would my responsibilities be? You would oversee all tenant relations, ensure compliance with housing laws, and help me develop policies that protect both the company and our tenants. You would also have the authority to resolve disputes before they escalate to legal action." Elena was quiet for a moment, processing the offer. "And the salary? $85,000 per year to start, plus full health benefits for you and your family. And I'll pay for you to complete your paralegal certification and continue your legal education." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. It was more money than she had ever imagined earning, and it would allow her to use the knowledge she had worked so hard to acquire. "There's one more thing," Richard said. "I want you to know that what you did in that courtroom didn't just save my company. It opened my eyes to things I had never considered before. I've been thinking about the families who were displaced from that building, and I want to make things right." "What do you mean?" I'm going to establish a fund to help those families find new housing. I'm also going to implement new policies to ensure that future renovations are done with proper notice and assistance for displaced tenants. Elena was amazed. Sir, you don't have to do that. Yes, I do. You showed me that success isn't just about profits. It's about doing the right thing. You've changed my perspective on everything. 2 months later, Eleanor sat in her new office on the 15th floor of the Harrison Properties building. The office had large windows overlooking Central Park, and the walls were lined with law books and housing code manuals. A small plaque on her desk read, Elena Martinez, Director of Tenant Relations. She was reviewing a case file when her assistant knocked on the door. Ms. Martinez, there's a family here to see you. They're having a dispute with one of our buildings. Eleanor smiled. Send them in. The family that entered was a young couple with 2 small children. They looked nervous and intimidated, much like Elena had felt when she first arrived in America 20 years ago. Please, have a seat, Elena said in both English and Spanish. How can I help you? Over the next hour, Elena listened to their story, reviewed their lease, and explained their rights under housing law. She was able to resolve their dispute without any legal action, ensuring they could remain in their apartment with a fair rent adjustment. As the family left, thanking her profusely, Elena reflected on how much her life had changed. She had gone from being invisible in Richard's house to becoming a key executive in his company. But more importantly, she was now in a position to help families like the ones she had grown up with. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. Mom, I just heard about what happened in court. I'm so proud of you. You're going to be an amazing lawyer someday. Elena smiled. She had indeed applied to law school and had been accepted to several programs. Richard had offered to pay for her education, but she had declined, preferring to earn her degree through her own hard work. She would attend classes at night while continuing her work at Harrison Properties. That evening, Eleanor returned to her apartment in Queens, where she had lived for the past 15 years. But now she was making plans to move to a larger place, one where her parents could visit from El Salvador, and where her daughter could have her own room when she graduated from law school. As she prepared dinner, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a scared immigrant working multiple jobs to survive, to a woman who had stood up in a courtroom and changed the course of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, she had learned that knowledge truly was power. But more importantly, she had learned that courage to use that knowledge was what made the difference. In helping Richard save his company, she had discovered her own strength and potential. The next morning, Elena arrived at her office to find a letter waiting for her. It was from Judge Monroe. Dear Ms. Martinez, I wanted to write to tell you how impressed I was with your performance in my courtroom. In 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a thorough understanding of housing law combined with such genuine concern for justice. I understand that you are planning to attend law school. I want you to know that the legal profession needs more people like you, people who combine knowledge with compassion and who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right. I would be honored to write a letter of recommendation for you, and I hope our paths cross again in the future. With respect and admiration, Judge Patricia Monroe. Eleanor read the letter twice, then carefully placed it in her desk drawer. She had come so far from the woman who had quietly cleaned houses and dreamed of a better life. Now she was living that better life, and she was determined to use her success to help others achieve their own dreams. As she looked out her office window at the bustling city below, Elena smiled. She had learned that sometimes the most unlikely people can change the world, one law book at a time, and she was just getting started.